So next I would want to invite up the executive editor of the JSTLP, Michael Lessard, who's going to be moderating our first panel of the day, as well as the panelists, Professor Alison Christians here from the McGill Faculty of Law, Professor Dr. Peter Brown from the McGill Department of Geography, and Dr. Carrie Riddich from the University of Toronto.
Donc, oui, sans plus tarder, merci et bienvenue à notre premier panel de la journée. Je n'aurais pas la prétention de commencer à répondre à la question, mais j'aimerais peut-être offrir mon interprétation de la question pour démarrer la lancée du panel. Et pour donner du sens à cette question-là, je pense qu'il est important de revenir à l'idée et au sujet de base de notre curriculum, c'est-à-dire droit durable, contexte changeant et judiciarité. Et droit durable, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par le droit durable? C'est l'idée, c'est une tentative d'instaurer les idées de développement durable au cœur de toutes les institutions et que ce soit l'institution judiciaire. Donc on parle de l'adaptabilité du droit par rapport au contexte changeant, ici dans le contexte, dans le contexte du panel, un contexte économique changeant dans l'idée du marché, du libre marché. Donc pourquoi on s'adresse au droit? Parce que c'est à la base même de nos institutions, c'est au final un créateur d'institutions. Et donc il nous faut aujourd'hui avoir un niveau de recul pour penser les institutions juridiques hors du droit domestique, hors même du droit transnational, peut-être dans une vision, je dirais même, de transsystémisme. Et j'aimerais souligner ici les travaux du professeur Glenn, notamment Legal Traditions of the World, qui est à la base d'une tentative de réflexion des institutions légales, de toutes les traditions, donc pas juste les grandes traditions juridiques occidentales, mais une tentative de recul pour voir ces institutions-là, non pas de manière concurrentielle, mais de manière polyvalente, cohérente et offrant des réponses différentes, certes, mais aux mêmes questions qui habitent le cœur des institutions humaines. Et je crois que c'est ce niveau de réflexion-là qu'on nous invite aujourd'hui à avoir et à développer un peu ce que Jeremy Rifkin appelait une conscience de l'humanité. Donc sortir de notre conscience domestique, sortir de la conscience continentale ou de la civilisation occidentale et parler de l'ensemble de la planète et des débats auxquels on fait face. Et enfin, professeur, c'est-à-dire Maître Tremblay, offrait de bons exemples par rapport aux droits de l'enfant. Et moi, quand je réfléchis, les questions qui nous sont posées aujourd'hui, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de les lier au travail que je fais au Journal de droit et politique du développement durable et des lier aux questions environnementales. Parce qu'après tout, dans la question qu'on nous pose pour le panel ici, comment est-ce que le droit peut maintenir les idéaux tels que la protection des droits humains dans une économie de libre marché sans limiter la croissance économique, on nous parle des droits humains. Et quand on parle de droits humains, on parle de la question environnementale. Et c'est un peu la base de notre discussion aujourd'hui, puis le contexte dans lequel on se trouve, c'est une critique de plus en plus virulente de ce qu'on a appelé la green economy ou la environmental economy. Donc une tentative de coincer, selon les critiques, de coincer la volonté de durabilité dans les réponses et les vieux modèles économiques. Et bon, la critique de ce modèle-là nous dit que ça nous empêche de développer de nouvelles valeurs et de nouvelles pistes de solutions pour le développement durable. D'ailleurs, professeur Éric Pinault de l'Université du Québec à Montréal nous dit que le développement durable est enfin un leurre qui nous pousse à moins polluer maintenant, mais pour pouvoir polluer sur un plus grand nombre de temps. Et d'ailleurs, en réponse à ces critiques au sommet des peuples de Rio de 2012, il y a un bon nombre d'organisations non gouvernementales qui ont rejeté directement l'idée même du green economy. Et j'ai bien hâte d'entendre ce que nos panélistes vont nous dire aujourd'hui pour voir quel est le rôle du droit dans, disons, la contextualisation et puis la structuration du libre marché dans une perspective de protection des droits humains. Et c'est là où je suis très content d'être bien entouré aujourd'hui. Donc, je vois à notre table, nous avons le professeur Christians, qui est une professeure à la faculté de droit de l'Université McGill ici, Nous avons professeur Brown qui est du département de géographie de l'Université McGill et professeur Ritchie qui nous vient de la Faculty of Law, the Women and Gender Studies and School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. Alors, je remercie beaucoup de s'être déplacé aujourd'hui. Sans plus tarder, je vais donner la parole à professeur Ritchie pour tenter de répondre à notre question. D'accord. Donc, professeur Christians.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, I had my name first in the program, so we had a quick confab before and said I can go first. I don't mind. I like to go first because I'm going to talk about tax, and if I talk about tax last, half of you will leave. I have you in my clutches because you're waiting to hear the real show that will come after me. Okay. So this question of sustainable development is just fascinating to me because, of course, sustainable development is all about jobs and growth, and I teach about tax, which is about taking money away from one person and collectivizing it to do common projects. So what's the connection? Well, I know that you know this, so this is not news to you, but every politician in the world runs on a platform of jobs and growth. We need jobs, we need growth. Our own Stephen Harper has a low tax plan for jobs and growth through training, trade, and low taxes. Low taxes. Barack Obama, our top priority has to be jobs and growth. Angela Merkel at Davos, we need a growth-oriented, sound fiscal policy, we need investments, we need jobs, and these jobs, not just content to have jobs, these jobs must be created in those areas which promise long-term, highly qualified employment. Tony Abbott, jobs and growth, not climate, is the top of the G20 agenda. George Osborne tweeted that the Eurozone has to have a better plan for jobs and growth. Chinese President Xi says China's success has depended on policies to maintain growth and good jobs. And Jacob Zuma of South Africa is counting on Chinese investment to stimulate jobs and growth in South Africa. So every politician everywhere, I've just given you some particularly visible ones that I probably don't even have to tell you, but every politician at every level is always telling you the same thing. We're going to get you employed, vote for us. And everyone's going to have a job. And when everybody has a job, we will grow together in a rising tide, lifting all boats in 1,000 points of light, and vote for me. So growth might not be a zero-sum game. That's the promise, right? A little bit of growth spreads across, everybody, rising tide, lifting all boats, everybody benefits. But jobs are, in fact, a zero-sum game. If China has everybody employed, then South Africa might not have everybody employed. If South Africa can get some of those factories to open in South Africa instead of China, then South Africans will be employed and not Chinese people. So, what's the connection to tax? Well, if you pay attention to the news, you may see a lot of this kind of stuff going on in the last couple of years. Protests about tax dodging by big companies, top names companies. And what's happening is that in many very wealthy countries, social welfare programs that we've become accustomed to are disappearing. So you'll see there's a connection being made in the public sphere between multinationals and what they're contributing, or big name companies, retail companies, and what they're contributing to revenues, and the ability of societies to sustain human-friendly programs like the welfare state, okay? And so how is this going to match up? We have a sort of a basic problem. And that is, if you want to talk about the services you need in a welfare state, then you're going to need to find revenue somewhere, but to get revenue somewhere, you're trying to tax the very people that you're trying to lure to hire all the people in your jurisdiction who you're trying to get to vote for you. You see the problem. So tax justice advocates come along, and we're talking about NGOs. There was some discussion of NGOs earlier. We're talking about grassroots groups and coalitions. And these are rights and cause-focused groups, And they come along and they start connecting tax avoidance to austerity, to government decisions to pull back on the welfare state in rich countries. And they're talking about the erosion of the welfare state in the UK, in a rich country, for example, and other places. Okay, and in the UK, you have a group that specifically targeted Starbucks. Here's their redesign of the Starbucks logo, refuge from the cuts. And this is what the message from the activists was. It's time for the government to wake up and smell the coffee. Women have had enough of being attacked by a cabinet of millionaires, but there is a refuge from the cuts. Join us to transform the tax dodger Starbucks into services women depend on, such as refuges and creches. So there was an action back a couple years ago as Starbucks responded to the pressure by saying, well, we have paid all the taxes that we owe under UK law. We are perfectly tax compliant. But we hear what you're saying, and our customers have spoken loud and clear, and here's an extra £20 million for the Treasury. Let us go on our merry way. Tax justice advocates are not happy with that result, and I think for good reason. Starbucks voluntarily throwing a little bit of money does not solve the structural problem of Starbucks saying we paid all the tax we owed by law, and it just happens that that comes to zero. So in the developing world, this problem is even perhaps more acute. Now we'll see if my little video works. When a company is being lured into your jurisdiction to provide jobs, it turns out that if you tax them, they don't particularly like that. But if you don't tax them, then where's the money for basic services? Now we're not talking about the welfare state anymore. Now we're talking about basic services like schools and healthcare. So here's a little clip, I hope it'll work, we'll see, from Zambia. Just an activist group trying to outline this problem in very brief terms.
Zambia Sugar generated profits of $123 million since 2007, but paid less than 0.5% in corporate tax. The report estimated that Zambian public services lost $27 million as a result of the tax avoidance, enough to put 48,000 children through school.
All right, so 48,000 children didn't go to school because Zambia Sugar didn't pay their taxes. Well, Zambia Sugar did pay their taxes, it's just that they weren't asked to pay very much. And you notice a causal connection being made. Zambia Sugar didn't pay or saved a bunch of money, not by being tax evaders. They're not flouting the law, they're following the law. And the law only required them to pay 0.5% in tax, and so that's exactly what they paid. And the activists want to try to make a link between that failure to tax Zambia Sugar and the inability to educate 48,000 Zambian children because there just aren't enough resources to do it. Well, you can see that there's a leap, there's a chasm, right, between those two. How do you know the 27 million that you're missing there is Zambia Sugar's fault, right? It's everybody's fault. We just don't have enough money. There's not enough money. So we don't have the services we need, but you can't blame Zambia Sugar, right? So the problem with tax avoidance is that this is a term that we're using to explain how you legally get to a rate of 0.5%. Now, back in the rich world in the United States, you might know who that guy is, Tim Cook. He stood in front of the Senate in the United States and said, and when asked, are you soulless, immoral tax dodgers? You seem to be. He said, we pay all the taxes we owe, every single dollar. And after he was very gently, I think, raked over the coals by an ambivalent Senate hearing, which was mostly for show, right? Editorials started popping up and people responding to this. And the general response, here's one: Congress wrote the tax laws, so why blame the CEOs for obeying them? And a lot of discussion about who's responsible for setting the tax rate. Is it the taxpayer? Clearly not. It must be the lawmaker. In almost none of this discussion, the interplay or the influence that a big company like Apple can have on lawmakers. And if you think that 15, that's in the United States, 14 million in the United States. If they're doing that in the United States, you know, we can be sure that that kind of influence peddling is going on everywhere. This is a big company, right? So, what is compliance? What is paying the tax you owe? What kind of inroads can an activist who wants to talk about missing services, what can they say about this situation where a company which is called to the carpet has a perfect defense? We paid everything you told us to pay. It's not us that makes the law. What do you want us to do? So, and I think the activists are up against something a little bit like this.
Well, I think what a lot of those companies would say, including Associated British Foods, is that they're actually going in for tax planning. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to maximize their profits, and in that process they're wanting to minimize their tax bill. And I remember as a student at the London School of Economics reading Stuart Holland's books in the 1970s about transfer pricing, and some people, particularly NGOs, get very uptight about companies' multinational tax planning, but I think it's the way of the world.
So you have a couple of messages there. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders to maximize profits, and that means we must minimize taxes. That is a statement you will hear managers say all over the world with no basis in any kind of, you know, there's no research to back that, there's no empirical claims about that. It's just, this is obvious, our job is to maximize profits, and therefore minimizing taxes must also be our job. And then his point is NGOs are a bit uptight about tax planning, but that's the way of the world, he says. You know, there's a certain release of responsibility in that statement, which is quite appalling, really. Well, it's just how it is. It's like a tree grows in the forest. I can't be asked to change that. That's like asking me to start over from the beginning or do something that's not my job, which is change the law. So, when you're trying to think about this problem, we don't have enough revenues for basic public schools. We're not protecting people's basic rights. We're losing the welfare state that we had in the developed world. There's people running all over the place not paying any taxes, and they have a lot of money. Well, what's the solution? Well, you might say the way to think about this is that this tax avoidance phenomenon, this tax planning phenomenon, the one that Keith Boyle said was the way of the world, is a governance failure, right? So we can say, okay, there's a collusion going on between government and industry. Apple goes in and lobbies. Apple supports the re-election campaign of Senators X, Y, and Z, and the government in turn encourages and rewards tax avoidance. And so this is a classic political malfunction. But nobody wants the result that we got here. We got tax avoidance, which reduced our revenues. Our reduced revenues, combined with a fiscal crisis, got us to austerity. Austerity killed the welfare state. That's not what we wanted. It's an error, so we just have to start over. And so the way that activists have looked at this governance failure is to try to find a way to interrupt the collusion. I know that's a loaded word, but the cooperation, the closeness between governments and lobbyist industry, try to interrupt this collusion by demanding a role for NGOs in lawmaking, whether it's within the country or in international circles, like in the OECD, for example. Okay, this is really hard, because even if you can get NGOs to the table, you know, they're not going to be listened to, right? You'll have people like Keith Boyle saying things like, well, NGOs get uptight about this or that, but they don't really know what they're talking about, and just let the experts handle this. This is tax. It's complicated, right? We're going to sit around and have high-level conversations that you activists don't know anything about, and, you know, go paint a sign or something and leave us alone, right? So it's really difficult, and it's a long slog, but we're seeing certain tax justice activists getting some play in this area. But so far, the picture looks pretty bleak. It's really hard to interrupt a regime that works really well for all the parties that it works well for. It's really hard to interrupt that. So this is the frontier, if you will, is to start talking about human rights violations. Instead of trying to get a seat at the table prospectively, where you can be at the planning stage, where you can be influencing how decisions are being made. You come in afterwards and say, what you've done here actually is inconsistent with some other regime, and so you've got to change your strategy. So we have a sort of a problem, though, in tax. I'm going to try to lay out this problem for you, and here's what I'm going to tell you. I don't know the solution, and so I spend a lot of time trying to get students to get excited about tax so that I can rope them into thinking about how do you frame a human rights complaint, a human rights articulation, a framework. How do you do that? You tell me. I need you. Right? So I spent a lot of time not answering questions, just asking them. So in the traditional civil political versus economic and social and cultural rights framework, we have a sort of uneasy, maybe not impossible, but pretty uneasy fit with something like, for example, the choice of a regressive tax system. That means a tax system where you just give up on those big, rich multinationals, and instead you try to fund the state with consumption taxes, value-added taxes, which hit consumers, right, and not capital, for example. So an easy but not impossible fit, maybe, to try to find that choice, try to find some sort of civil political right violation, some sort of economic and social right violation. This is not easy. There's a framing problem. And our missing causal link might be empirical and it might be legal. So that is, if you look at taxpayer groups, you have rich group A is multinational corporations with all kinds of money and all kinds of power and all kinds of influence. And then you have a pot of revenues that we have available to pay for all the things we want. How do we make the connection that it's you, group A, you're the reason we can't have the services we want, and it's not some other reason, right? There's the causal problem there. I don't know how to solve that. I think that's an empirical problem, but it could be a legal problem too, just trying to find who is to blame when you can't fund the services that everybody agrees should be basic. And then the second missing causal link or problem is that governments can't actually control revenues. They can set their tax systems, but they don't know how much money that's going to bring in. It depends on you, right? Set the tax rate at 10%. Well, how much money did you make? Because if you made $1 million, then 10% might get us something. But if you only made $10, then 10% isn't going to get us much of anything at all. And so governments can't control that. And so we're back in the world of, well, we need growth because no matter what your tax rate is, the more growth you have, the more tax revenues you're going to be able to produce. So let's just get the engine going, right, and not worry about it. This is a really difficult problem if you're going to try to say that human rights, perfecting people's human rights, relies on a revenue stream, a certain given expenditure, for example, or commitment. The other problem that I have is this is a really difficult one for me to solve. I don't know how to even really think about this. And this is this traditional citizen-state container in which most human rights litigation seems to take place. That is, the person who is harmed by their own state. You take your state to task for violating your human rights. But in tax, there's an uneasy fit here in that most of the financial regulation that impacts somebody like Mr. Boyle's transfer pricing for multinationals, that's done in the north. It's regulated from the OECD, and the capital flows out through the rest of the world, and then the south feels the impact of the global south, right? So there's an uneasy fit because it's the wrong connection. Not this state to this citizen, but this citizen to an amalgamation of states who work over here to set norms and standards that everybody has to follow, and now you're trapped in this kind of weird situation where, well, that's the way of the world. Whose fault is that? And then here the missing causal link is legal or structural, and that is it lawmakers in one state versus peoples of other states? Is it policymakers working in soft law type networks, international networks where they're setting, standards, but they're not saying what the rules are? How do you then sort of pull any kind of causal connection or name a harm and name a perpetuator of a harm and connect that up to the victim and find out how to get a remedy? It's really, I think, very difficult. So the activist response to this is, I would say, right now, build a factual record. This is, I think, what activists are doing right now. They're going around the world and saying, this is the empirics of the situation. This is what we can't have. We don't have public schools. We continue to have problems with water. We don't have, we have regressive tax systems. We're not getting justice, da-da-da-da-da. Empirical, factual record, and try to sway the public into seeing tax revenues as a component of human rights realizations. Just get people to see that, right? Sway the public. And what's going to happen, and we'll see this from name and shame campaigns, and we have something emerging called the fair tax mark that some activists put together. Listen, put this, if you show that you're a good corporate citizen and you pay your fair share of tax and you're contributing to revenues, you can put this little fair tax mark on your product, and then people will want to buy you. It's like fair trade, right? Not much traction. I got to be honest with you, they're not making much traction so far, but it's, nascent. So, but even more nascent or emerging is this building a causal case in law, and this is where I try to get students who know something about human rights, and I say all sorts of wild things to them. Well, why can't we sue so-and-so and da-da-da-da-da? And they tell me, you can't do that. But I want them to explain it to me in simple terms I can understand, so that I can argue with them. All right. So it's a big challenge as to who, how, and where to sue. Now, I got my end. I'm on my last slide. It's going to take me 30 seconds to do this, okay? What's the connection between jobs, growth, and tax? Well, on the one side, you need tax for a functioning society. We have a problem where the wealthy really do have escape routes. They're not evading necessarily. They may just have a lot of influence and ability to not have to contribute a whole lot. And on the other side, you have less wealthy workers, mostly, who are trapped into the state, and they're going to do what they're told to do, which is pay consumption taxes and pay payroll taxes. We need tax for a functioning society. Can we get enough out of those people that are trapped? Can we get enough? So on the other side is that employees need employers. So you have this vision of industry and the welfare state. They go together. Yeah, the workers are trapped. Yeah, we're going to get all of our revenues from that to pay for all these things we want. But if we have employers and they are giving us good jobs, then those are going to fit together, and we're going to have human rights perfection, we're going to have growth, everything's going to be great. But the reality is a return to sort of pay for hire, worker protections, non-existent, artisanal miners, that sort of thing, right? And so attracting those employers, job creators, is not necessarily building that industry and welfare state at all. It could be doing quite the opposite of that. So the problem with the connection is there's just not enough overlap, I think. And so somehow human rights steps into that and says, when there's not enough overlap, is there a responsibility somewhere to cure it? That's all I have for you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Good afternoon. And first of all, let me thank very, very much the editors of the Journal of Sustainable Development Law and Policy for the invitation. It's really, really a pleasure to come to McGill, and in particular to see so many students. Always a fabulous audience. So thanks very, very much. Alison has just done me an enormous favor in at least two ways, so let me just articulate what those are. First of all, she's put on the table the proposition that we should think of tax as a human rights issue. I want to endorse that proposition 110% and add to it and suggest that we should see all kinds of things as about human rights, macroeconomic policy, monetary policy, and so forth, although I'm not going to talk about that today. But the second thing that she's done, which is hugely helpful for me and something that I hope you'll bear in mind, is demonstrate a point that I am just going to assume is true. And that is that we are in the midst of a global rather than a national or regional conversation about law and policy. It's not just serendipitous that Angela Merkel and the president of Mexico and who knows however many other global leaders are generating remarkably similar templates for approaching the problems of the day, and that they reiterate continually that the focus is jobs and policies. She's also helpfully, I think, suggested that there's a lot of economic interest beneath all of this. So remember all of that. It's going to be hugely helpful, although I'll turn the focus slightly myself. So let me just start with the observation that since about 1999, it has become completely familiar and ordinary to link respect for human rights to prospects for economic growth. Rather than something that has to be brought into the project of economic growth, everybody in the international order, and that includes the international financial and economic institutions, as well as the human rights groups, accept the proposition that the promotion of human rights and economic growth are part of what we actually mean by development. And, you know, the moment that we want to remember here is just the appearance of Amartya Sen's book, Development as Freedom, which articulated the idea that human rights play both an instrumental role in development. They promote economic growth, but they have a constitutive role to play. Okay, so human rights as part of development, this has become a global common sense. All right, so we're at a very interesting moment. Now that human rights are officially inside of the project to promote economic growth, I want to suggest that we are effectively in the midst of a battle of representation, a battle over ideas. What does it mean to respect human rights, and what precisely do we expect the addition of human rights to economic growth agendas to do? And let me just step back for a moment and just remind everybody of something that I'm sure you all know, which is that the push for greater attention to human rights in the context of growth, whether that means attention to Indigenous rights or to workers' rights or to gender equality, is rooted in the recognition that growth alone isn't a sufficient objective by any measure when it comes to development. Why? Because it's completely clear that economic growth projects not only can, but routinely do, exact costs, often from the most vulnerable groups, and that there are many, many constituencies that don't benefit in any measurable way from the project of economic development. Many of these costs aren't counted in the calculus of economic growth, and many of them aren't even observed. So human rights is the universal language of social justice, and many of these concerns have been framed as human rights concerned. And the idea was that the addition of human rights would somehow catalyze a transformation in the current approach to economic growth. So I have been, for, I hate to say it, about 20 years now, looking at the relationship between human rights and development projects on the international plane. And I thought it might be useful for the purposes of our collective conversation about this to simply make a couple of observations about how this recognition of human rights is currently informing the approach to economic growth. But I also want to make some observations about something which is deeply related to that, and that is what's happening to the mainstream or conventional understanding of human rights in the process. So let me describe what I think of as a process of convergence and fragmentation. Here's the basic idea. Development, economic, financial institutions have now made space for human rights in their agendas and projects to promote economic growth, but they have adapted what I think of as a convergentist strategy for doing so. What do I mean by that? I mean that they have reconceptualized human rights in ways that confirm rather than challenge or disrupt the market-centered projects to which they're already committed. And for the most part, they are incorporating human rights concerns in ways that are completely consistent with the regulatory and policy reform projects to which they are already committed. And I'm going to elaborate that, but that in some ways is the bottom line. So the great Indian jurist and human rights scholar Upendra Bakshi and many other people at this point now too have observed that since the end of the Cold War, there has been the rise of what he calls market-friendly conceptions of human rights. And what he means by that is when human rights are invoked, they are very likely invoked to mean support for freedom of expression, freedom of association and the rule of law, but also to support standard commercial rights such as property rights and the enforcement of contracts. And just as importantly, competing conceptions of human rights have been demoted. Social and economic rights, rights to development, for example, even though they are very much still part of the corpus of international law and international human rights. Okay, there are many, many reasons why this is true, but I want to suggest that the market dominant or market-friendly conception of human rights, which I actually think is the mainstream of conception of human rights at the present moment, certainly among many international institutions and lots of technocratic elites. There are many reasons for it, but I want to suggest that one is actually this effort to marry human rights and economic growth. Because a series of really interesting things have flowed from that effort to try and reform economic growth to make it more responsive to human rights concerns. One of the most important things is that development bodies, finance and economic organizations, and technocrats, not just human rights bodies and NGOs and social justice activists, now routinely weigh in on what it means to advance human rights, workers' rights, gender equality, and how to go about poverty alleviation. There are literally hundreds, perhaps thousands of reports right now from institutions like the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF on these questions, and they all have detailed policy advice on how to go about pursuing these objectives. Now, it's perhaps not especially surprising that when they think about these new questions of human rights and social justice, they do so in a way that's informed by their other concerns. And so what happens at the other end is that we have labor rights and gender equality considerations, for example, recast in the language of efficiency and reconceived as concerns that are pertinent to productivity and efficiency. Okay, now, I've written a lot, I've thought a lot about what's going on in these institutions. Why is it of broader interest? I think it's because the engagement of a much wider range of institutions and actors with questions of human rights and governance has catalyzed, it's certainly coincided with, and I think it's catalyzed a significant transformation in how we think about social justice generally. What I'm observing is that an increasing reliance on market mechanisms, market metrics, and market indicators to both advance and to measure human rights and social justice. States, but also NGOs and international institutions have all become deeply invested in the use of market participation as a way to further justice. Whether that concerns women, workers, the poor, the path to progress is almost invariably more and higher levels of engagement with the market. All right, so what's happened? We have a series of arguments about the beneficial social as opposed to economic effects of legal reforms to support market activities. But we also have a human rights and a social justice justification rather than purely an economic justification for policies to economic growth. And so I'm at the point where I'm prepared to think of the promotion of the rule of law and human rights as well as economic development as simply one integrated, largely coterminous enterprise that sometimes travels under the label of good governance. Okay. This might seem like a really good thing, and maybe on some level it is. It's surely something we should talk about a great deal. But I want to just zero in on 3 consequences which were a little bit unexpected and somewhat more ambiguous. The first is a massive expansion of the agenda for legal and policy reform on the part of international institutions and technocrats. And this is something that has quite broad implications for questions of democratic control and legitimacy. I think it's directly related to what Alison was talking about when she was problematizing the control over the tax agenda, right? Who's actually making this, and whose interest does it serve? The second, and I'll spend a little time talking about this, is this significant reimagination of human rights and social justice objectives. When human rights activists, gender equality activists pushed the World Bank and other institutions to pay attention to human rights, when they said, for example, as they said in 1995 at the Beijing World Conference for Women, the World Bank violates women's rights, I don't think they anticipated what was going to happen. I think maybe I'll just talk directly about what happened. So here's what the World Bank did in fairly short order. It generated its own platform for promoting economic gender equality, one that is distinctly market-centered. It was based on 2 interrelated claims. One, the idea that if you invested in gender equality, you could expect good development outcomes, but market-centered development would also reliably improve the position of women. So far from an antagonist to gender equality and human rights, the World Bank is its best friend, okay? Or their best friend, rather. So we have an entire report that pivots around the expected benefits to women from participating in markets. Everything from a release to poverty to greater investment in girls' education to, and this really is, you know, a piece of magic if you can pull it off, a redistribution in the unpaid work between men and women. So all kinds of things were promised by market-centered development. Okay, now, for those of us who had our roots in the human rights movement or human rights scholarship, this originally seemed like a bizarre and distinctly marginal way to think about gender equality. But it turns out that we were wrong. It's become more and more central. Market-centered gender equality programs are increasingly mainstream. You can find them in the public and in the private sphere, and increasingly in hybrid initiatives. Philippe Tremblay mentioned public-private initiatives with respect to human rights in his talk. I'll just mention that the biggest single initiative of UN Women, which is the umbrella organization to promote all the gender-related initiatives at the United Nations in the last couple of years, is the Calvert Principles, which is a project to simply get private sector actors and businesses to promote the empowerment of women. This is just a classic example of where we are now. Okay, so I think, let me just describe how at the level of law and policy, what promoting gender equality now looks like. And I think I probably won't have time to walk you through a parallel set of transformations in respect of workers' rights. Maybe I can just mention a couple if I have a moment. But let me just tell you how the World Bank articulates the policy and legal reform priorities when it comes to promoting gender equality. So here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to reduce the gaps in women's human capital endowments, close the earnings and productivity gaps, shrink the differentials between women and men when it comes to voice and influence, and limit the reproduction of gender equality through endowments, economic opportunities, and agency, right? So gender equality is completely articulated in the language of productivity, competitiveness, and economic objectives. And I think to drill down even one more level, here's how a concrete gender equality problem, that of ensuring access to water, is imagined in terms of law reform. What should you do? Well, you need to enforce contractual obligations. You need to protect property rights. You need to employ the private sector to take on tasks once associated with the state, and you need to implement user fees and raise taxes on consumers. Okay, now just stand back for a moment and think about this as a project to advance gender equality. It's pretty remarkable. There's no mention of women and gender, but for anybody who works in the field of law and development, it's completely familiar, and it's completely familiar as the standard recipe for promoting private sector economic growth. And so here we have a total convergence and overlap of the promotion of gender equality and economic growth. How am I doing for time here? Okay, a few minutes. Okay, so just a brief word about workers' rights. It's more difficult to merge the project of workers' rights with economic growth. Why? Because workers' rights have historically emerged out of a conflict between labor and capital, and things like freedom of association, rights to collective bargaining, and minimum terms and conditions of work are the product of the recognition that in a standard market for labor, without them, workers typically lack the bargaining power to ensure reasonable conditions of work, indeed, to have any say over the labor contract at all. Nonetheless, when economic and financial institutions were confronted with the political reality, one that was catalyzed by deep NGO engagement, that they could no longer simply blow workers' rights off and say, not our business, we don't really care about this. They adopted a really interesting strategy, which I would describe as one of redescribing the problem. And it's very interesting because it's been remarkably influential at reframing the global debate around work. And it's exactly what Alison described. It's about linking jobs and economic growth. So apart from a really brief nod in the direction of core workers' rights based on the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights, there's been a really interesting shift in frame to questions of work standards, to the question of economic opportunities. For institutions like the World Bank, the whole problem has become not the classic problems of workers' rights, responding to the disabilities of workers in the labor market, but instead focusing on the entrepreneurial capabilities of the worker and the effective deployment of labor resources. So the regulatory task is stated like this. How can the reallocation of workers be accelerated from areas and activities with low productivity to those with greater potential? Can entrepreneurship be fostered, or is it born? Okay, I need to stop because I don't want to take up any more time. There has been a remarkable rhetorical and discursive transformation in the field of workers' rights and gender equality. So I think we need to pay attention to the fact that we simply think of and talk of these things in radically different ways. Human rights bodies are no longer the only game in town. They face a deep challenge by these other conceptions of social justice objectives, and states face or now have the luxury of choice. And I think it's, when you think of it this way, it's not that surprising that they would choose strategies that are less rather than more demanding in terms of resources and that are convergentist with their other governance objectives. Thanks.
Great to be here. The Student Association is a wonderful opportunity to bring up some difficult issues that maybe get a little more ventilation. And it's a pleasure to be here and to hear these two great talks and be part of this. I'm going to be a little bit out of step as usual, but that's sort of the way my life tends to go. So when I got invited to give this talk, I began to think about what kind of ideas these were and to wonder what held them together. And whether the three ideas that were on the human rights, free markets, and economic growth seemed to me to be ideas that belonged to a different era. And so I decided to try to work with that metaphor a little bit and then see what, if I'm allowed to leave the room alive kind of thing happens, or what else. And so I want to really pose the question of whether these ideas belong, to storage where you put dead things, or whether they were where you put things that are still of interest, like in a museum, and then you visit them, and then you get insights about the present, right? So I'll see if I can make this work, and you can let me know later. So one of my principal arguments is that we're in a different geological era. This is a term now that's become reasonably familiar. The Anthropocene is contrasted with the Holocene, the era in which most of what's called civilization emerged, and which now a number of people think has come to an end, right, and so forth. And there's a lot of dispute about whether this term is the right term or when it began, so but I'm going to use it as a useful metaphor. And it's the era when humans emerge as major players in the Earth's biogeochemical systems, changes in the ocean, acidification, changes in the very profound changes in the direction of evolution itself, changes in the atmosphere, and so forth. These are all happening at a global level. So what I'm going to question is how well these ideas will work in a new situation, right? And in the 20th century, particularly since 1950, there was a huge increase in our scientific knowledge of history, the history and processes of the universe, and paradoxically, a sharp decrease in our experience of the universe through light pollution. So we used to have a lot more perception of the universe, but now through the wonders of Hydro-Quebec and other advances like that, we can't see this night sky. So we know more, but we experience less. And what's coupled are, hand in hand, more or less, with our increase in scientific knowledge is, in my view, a slowing down of, or even stopping of, the increases in reflection in some of the social sciences. And I use the metaphor for this, that there's a group of disciplines which in my view are economics, finance, law, governance, and ethics, which are more or less somewhat self-isolating from the advances in science, and so there's kind of a disjunct in our knowledge systems that's, I think, having very profound negative consequences. So I'm going to just now talk a little bit about each of the three concepts: human rights, free markets, and economic growth, and try to make the argument that there are problems in each of these areas that need a lot more probing than they often get. So I'm not at all against human rights. I think human rights play and continue to play a crucial role in 20th and 21st centuries, and that they kind of stepped into a moral vacuum that emerged after the collapse of the Thomistic synthesis, which occurred, who knows, been occurring for hundreds of years, but really came to a head at the conclusion of the 19th century. Perhaps one of the low points in ethics, in my view, is G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, written at the beginning of the 20th century, which was I think, a confession of really being pretty much at a loss of where to go. But I wanted to sort of focus on one human right that seems to be the least problematical, and to show why it maybe is the most problematical, and why it's, when you think hard about it, it's really kind of sickening. So we take it, I'm from the United States originally, as you probably can tell. We think freedom is the best thing ever, right? And we want more of it, and we're glad we have what we have, and, we got our guns and whatever, right? The problem is that in freedom, particularly in high-energy societies that have high use of fossil fuel societies, like this one, like Canada, the United States, other industrialized nations, freedom of choice seems to unavoidably involve the killing of other people. So there's a conflict between the moral premise of freedom of choice and the golden rule, right? One of the things I remember as a little kid that I was taught many, many times, that the sort of fundamental moral wrong is to gratuitously injure or kill another person, right? But we seem to be doing this in a very routine manner, just in the way we live, right? We're not evil people who get up in the morning and think, how much harm can we do? But our behavior actually inflicts considerable harm both on current populations of humans, future humans, and of course many, many other species, which in my view have significant moral standing themselves. So to quote Naomi Klein, this changes everything, right? This once you connect physics, second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, however you want to call that, with the golden rule and with the postulate of freedom of choice, there's a big, big problem. So I think there's a number of other things that would be useful to reflect on in thinking about human rights. One is, why is it only humans that have them, right? Why wouldn't other creatures or other entities, even wouldn't have to be living, have rights? And of course there are movements along these directions. One thing that's happened in the emergence of the scientific narrative of cosmic and biological evolution is to take away some of the premises that support human superiority or human difference or human privilege that can be supported in the Genesis narrative, but can't be supported in what's called the big history narrative or the cosmological narrative from current astrophysics and from current thinking about how the universe works and how it's headed to be, where it's headed. So my argument basically is in part that freedom couldn't be a foundational idea of society like it is in the United States, like couldn't be the fundamental postulate of a polity, but rather that freedom can exist only within a sphere of justice which allocates what freedom means, what shares you can rightfully take, right? So I use a different metaphor here, freedom should live in a modest room in the mansion of justice, right? So you have to have society basically has to have a conception of justice and then fits freedom into that rather than postulates freedom and then lets justice sort of come out of that by whatever means it does. So looked at this way, in the Anthropocene, there are no unqualified rights to consumption or reproduction. Each of these areas of choice have to be contextualized, and what's responsible in the area of choice has to be reflected upon and cannot be assumed. Free markets. Well, I'm a student of Polanyi. I don't think there ever were free markets, right? I don't think free markets arise spontaneously or anything like that, right? They're usually contrived. But I'm ignoring that. I'm drawing here on some work of a very good friend of mine, John Fullerton, who's done some work on the discipline of finance. One of the things that's so I have a background in philosophy. I've been in the geography department. I don't know why, it's because I guess I can read a map, but I can't fold one, so I've never read a lot of literature in finance until fairly recently. I've only read a little bit now, but I read a finance textbook, and one of the interesting things about the textbook was there was no mention whatsoever of the Earth. There wasn't, I don't think, a single phrase in a 500-page book about the fact that this is taking place here. Right? So there's a huge disjunct between this massively powerful framework and how that relates to the future of planet Earth. John Fullerton's come up with this idea that if there's such a thing as planetary overshoot, as we're using more than one planet to carry on the way we carry on, there must be financial overshoot. There must be investments in places that don't make sense, right, from the point of view of how the planet functions. One of the more astonishing things he's come up with is just to point out that if you looked at all the financial instruments let's say any year you want to choose, 1982 to the present, there's the explosion of financial instruments, of so-called wealth, right, between that year or any other year related to that if you want it, and the present, right? There's the amount of money around is just, that's no problem, 10 minutes, no problem. Is enormous compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago, but the Earth is actually smaller, right? The Earth, the life support capacity of the planet is smaller than it was. So is this a problem? I've asked some people that work in central banks this question. They don't know. So there are a lot, if you look going down this line of reasoning, there are a lot of what's now called stranded assets, right? Things where people have invested their money, but by any reasonable moral standards, they should not be allowed to reap the fruits of their investments. It's called stranded assets. The tar sands is an example of this, right? Simply immoral to do this, right? A lot of firms, including French government and other places, have invested in it, but it needs to stay in the ground. Okay, so looked at from this point of view, there should be limits to investment, right? So you don't get, you create this flood of money. People can invest wherever they want to invest. Well, if you think we're in the Anthropocene, you don't want to do that, right? You want to have both the total amount of investment constrained and the direction of investment constrained in order to deal with the destabilization of planetary life support systems, right? It would be much better to take the money that might be spent on a Hummer plant and spend it on a wind farm or bicycles or something like that, right? Within the Anthropocene, there can't be neutrality with respect to the purposes of investment. So you need to have, basically, to think of money as a public asset, as a public utility, if you like, and to subject it to public oversight and control, both magnitude and both from the point of view of the quantity and quality of investment. So it raises the question of whether political liberalism and economic liberalism are both in the same sort of soup, right? They've got premises that underlie them that seem to be highly problematical and, at least by ordinary standards of morality, quite difficult. Okay, so it also follows from this sort of general line of reasoning that there shouldn't be any more aggregate global economic growth. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be growth in some places and not in others, but the notion that the horrendous pictures of all the people who were for growth, and I don't know, it's depressing. So anyway, we don't know how to have growth without producing more carbon dioxide or other waste, right? I mean, the second law of thermodynamics, just plain true, right? We just don't know how to do that. We probably never can figure it out, but at least we don't know how to do it now. So we can't have a global policies of having more growth. So if you look at it this way, principal duty of rich countries like Canada and the UK, many of the ones that were mentioned, is to seek an orderly and prompt degrowth in consumption and population to allow ecological space for the poor and for other species. Right? We're getting crowded off the Earth. And there are a number of reasons for growth. Why do we want this to begin with? Well, growth. A lot of what's on this slide comes from a good friend of mine's work, Peter Victor. Well, we have a population increase, so we need growth because we've got more people around. We have productivity gains, so we need to have more growth so you can build a car now with robots, right? So you don't need so many people with wrenches standing there on the line. So those people get laid off, and so you need more growth, so there's something else for them to do, right? One of the most dangerous things that you can have on Earth is unemployed men, right? And so you need some way to get them off the streets, right, and out of the bars into doing something, useful or apparently useful. And then you need to reduce poverty, and you need wealth brings increased productivity. Growth brings increased well-being through having more television sets, Coca-Cola, and potato chips. And there's also, quite was in the other lectures, there's a consumption, employment, and power compact, right, between the people who run the governments in the countries that were listed and so-called full employment and high levels of consumption. So these are not some sort of fatal juggernaut. Each of these can be redirected and reimagined in a different society. Right? We can solve all of these problems without growth. We just don't do it. And so back to the beginning. Is this a crypt or a museum? So I think in a kind of Hegelian way, these ideas have turned out to be their own worst enemy, right? As they've become more and more the dominant discourse, right? They brought about planetary instability. that may be runaway. So we need to think about whether they're fatal. That would be the crypt part of the metaphor, or just a museum, right? Just ideas that were interesting for a while, and then we left, and then we'd go back and look at them occasionally, like we do to Renoir or things like that. So are we going to continue on a fatal course? Or are we going to look on these ideas as episodes in an historical pageant on a flourishing planet? They're not necessarily bad ideas completely. They just don't fit the circumstances. And whether we can pull ourselves out of the crypt and into the museum, I guess, is the challenge of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
Bon. Donc, j'inviterai maintenant les personnes de l'audience qui ont des questions à venir les poser. Yeah, well, I think you can answer that question directly, and then we'll take 2 or 3 questions.
So very simply, a carbon tax is just another sort of tax, and you have to ask yourself if you're going to be able to get it collected or not. Like, it's an administrative, you're just switching it up, right? So I'm sort of neutral about the revenue, whether it raises revenue or not, right? But, I mean, if it does, great, it's a tax that raises revenue, and if not, not so great. So it's always the same problem with whatever tax you have, is the distributional question. So who's actually bearing the cost of the carbon tax, and does it in fact reduce carbon? So it's very much a design issue. It's a great question, and I think a lot of people much more accomplished than me are in fact looking at this. And there's a project at McGill out of the business school called Eco Tax, maybe. And you should look at it, because this is exactly what they're studying and trying to make some waves on this. And I think those guys would be able to give you a sense of whether there's in fact any kind of human rights. Yeah, it's a very specific tax. So yeah, thanks.
So we'll take 2 other questions for the panel.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My question goes to Professor Christians, and I have a bit of difficulty in actually formulating the question, which might come across more as a comment, but I'll try and turn it into a question. The problem that you posed when you said jobs and growth is what all these politicians are essentially doing, and you read a lot of these reports, and you might get President Obama or the White House coming out and saying that this month we created 235,000 jobs, and we question whether really did they create the jobs, or did business and enterprise create the jobs that were facilitated by the policies that the White House essentially puts out, right? And so when you talk about the problem, and there was a link that you were trying to say about, well, in Zambia there's 125 million that was missed because they had 0.5%, and so we could have had 48,000 students put through school, and so we're trying to make the link between this and that. For me, at least, the problem that seems to arise from this is that we have a population, a bunch of people, and we're trying to provide something for them. We would, in most cases, call them public goods, health, education, primarily, if we take those 2 things. And we put the onus on delivering those things on the state, right, on the government. But increasingly, the world that we live in, as the other guy was saying, well, this is just the way of the world, transfer pricing, et cetera, is that a lot of the problems that we face are now global, they're cross-border, they don't really exist within the state. And so that social contract that once used to exist of citizens necessarily complying with their governments because the governments had the power to necessarily regulate what was happening within their jurisdictions, and therefore to also provide for their citizens, isn't really the situation that we face anymore. And taxation seems to be one of those tools of essentially saying, if we can regulate what's happening within our jurisdiction, then we can provide those goods and services that are of public nature, such as health and education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question more so, if I can turn this into a question, is should the obligation, because as soon as you say tax avoidance is a human rights, let's not forget human rights is international law, and that's an obligation on the state, so we're bringing back the states into the conversation. Should the provision of things like health, education, etc., be primarily on the state in this day and age if we're talking about the provision of them? Because at the end of the day, that population and those people, all they really do want is the health and the education. Should it matter if it's coming from the state? That's my question.
It's an excellent question. I'm sure my fellow panelists can help answer it. Uber, who I mentioned on one of my slides, Uber BV, which is a Netherlands company, has an app. And if you like, you can go on the app and you can sign up and then you can be a driver, a taxi driver. And Uber will link you to riders. And the riders will pay Uber, and Uber will withhold 20% of that payment to you, the driver. And Uber claims you're not an employee of Uber, therefore you're not entitled to any worker protections, and Uber's not even here. So can you regulate this artisanal driving experience? It defies everything we think we know about employment and employee protection. So, but if Uber is going to be responsible for drivers, then is it an employer or isn't it? And how can we decide that except in law? So the question of whether people are going to be protected for the risks of dealing with each other in society, whether they're going to organize themselves in ways where they can hold each other accountable for the risks that we have of living in our societies, that it is really difficult to conceptualize how we do that when Uber can come along and blow apart every relationship we think we have. So I have not answered your question. I've merely shifted the terms of it to say exactly, I don't think that the state is working, but if that's where the human rights articulation exists, what is the next step? And that's what I think we can turn it back to our geographer here to tell us, well, at what point in human relations with each other did we decide, you I'm responsible for, and what happens to you, I'm in a community with you, but you are not in my community, so I don't have to worry about you. And at what point did we make that legal? Did we write that down and say, now my obligation to you is in law, and now you can come and hold me accountable if I don't follow through? There, see, I turned you over to the...
I'm not going to give a very good answer. I mean, I think we're citizens,
it's Anthropocene, right?
Citizens of the universe, right? That's the framework, the community of beings. So I don't like to have little boundaries to say, if there's a line here and I'm not responsible past the line. There's an obligation of compassion and care for all things. And I think it's, as I mentioned, the Thomistic synthesis, I think that was a broad, encompassing, imperfect, from my point of view, framework that, when it fell apart over several centuries, opened up the moral and social chaos of the 20th century. And Albert Schweitzer wrote in around 1920 that the 20th century was going to be a bad century because it didn't have any framework to judge behavior. Right? It had no ethical guidelines. Unfortunately, that was a pretty good call, and it looks like this century's getting off to a similar sorry start.
Next question.
Yeah, so my question is also
mainly for Professor Christians. I'm really sorry, but it would be great to also get some commentary from the other speakers.
Well, I
on
don't
that.
usually get the questions because I talk about tax, so I much appreciate it.
Well, I think tax is actually not that boring. I personally, I was an activist. I worked with ActionAid as an NGO in Zambia, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Zambia Sugar was really one of the companies really targeted with this kind of name and shame campaign that you were talking about. I just think there's a lot of like practical issues with that. So I was just wondering if you, or any of you, if you could just give me, us your take on like what practical solutions could be in order to like create change and put pressure on like companies and also governments, because in the end I think I can echo this kind of idea of there is really a collusive environment where all the actors that have the power to change something are pretty much involved in the system. So where is that pressure supposed to come from to change the system and make economic development in some sense more equitable and also more inclusive for everyone, so that, I mean, whether you believe that the government has the obligation to collect tax and give it back to their fellow citizens, but I mean, in the end, the resources, let's say Zambia, there's copper, there's sugar, these resources belong to the people in some way, right? So where's that pressure supposed to come from to force the government, to force the companies to pretty much share the benefits equally?
So I think my answer to that is that what we have seen, and ActionAid, so where did you go? You worked for ActionAid, so you know that they're very active in this. The name and shame is about articulating a wrong, right? It's just saying, hey, you guys are doing something wrong, right? And it's not necessarily saying it's your fault or exclusively your fault, but something is being done wrong and you're implicated in that. And then go from that to we're going to have a legal change that's going to force a behavioral change. That's a huge chasm. So on your slide, again, I'm just thinking about the slide that you put where controlled degrowth. So, okay, if we opened the borders and we didn't have immigration laws the way we had today, people envision what the world would look like, this cosmopolitan society, where the workers would not be trapped and the capital would not be free to go and exploit them. But instead, people could move around and go wherever they wanted to. They could literally pick up and go. And even then, in that world, of course, many people would be constrained by resources. They could not pick up and go anywhere they wanted to go. They would exactly stay where they were, and who knows, all the people that had resources would leave and go to Switzerland, for example. It's a nice place. It's a very lovely, nice little cottages, and everybody wants to live there. It's very pleasant, and there's good coffee shops and so on, but there's not enough space there for everybody, so what's going to happen? So you sort of imagine this borderless world where people can move, and now everybody's moving. Capital is moving, and people are moving. Now, how do we get accountability? Are we talking about one world government or what? Like, what's your vision, right? But I don't know. But I know for sure that when I hear someone say, as Professor Brown did, and I absolutely agree with this, that we have to have controlled degrowth, imagine that in order for things to be equal, we have to actually take our living standards quite a bit down. Like, we have to drop quite a bit of the things that make our lives comfortable. Because people, around the 3/4 of the population, is living in misery. And we are living in comfort. So to get anywhere near balance, we're going to have to degrow quite substantially. Like, a lot. And how do you get people to voluntarily do that? That's not for a tax person to answer. That's for, I don't know. Someone else must have a better answer.
What they have microphones.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a great question. Yeah. Thank you.
So for the benefits of time, I'll take the 3 questions and then you can answer them. So I'll start with.
I actually don't have a question. I have some observations. May I share? Okay. So I don't know how to make degrowth happen, but I don't think people want to live in misery. And I study law and development in the emerging economies context. And I think growth is happening. And I'm going to throw some numbers in because I am an economist. I like statistics. So 4 billion people do live outside the purview of law as we understand it, formal law. In India, which is a country of 1 billion, 2.89% of people pay taxes. So if we are looking at taxes, then only 2.89% of a 1.25 billion population pays taxes. 70 to 90% of growth is happening in emerging economies in informal sector, which is outside the protection of formal law and institutions. And yet things are changing, and things are changing for better. So if we just look from human rights perspective or justice perspective or access to justice perspective, I think just to give you one good example of India, is 750 million people have become legal people. They have now a proof that they exist. And that has happened over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And now rights and aspirations are being realized because they exist and they can demand. So I think just the fact that some of these things are happening, I think the relationship between, in a democratic setting, I'm talking about a very particular democracy, that the relationship between governance structures and people who are being governed is changing. And just to give you bring back your example of Uber. So Uber is being sued in many countries, including India, and that gives you a sense of law, development, justice. And to bring back your discussion on gender, that Uber is being sued because a woman actually now has the courage to report that she was violated. She actually goes on Facebook and posts the number of the Uber taxi guy, saying that this is the number of the cab which drove me and left me there. So I'm just saying that, you know, I think there is a lot of emphasis, I think, on distributive justice. I think one of the areas which is still not explored so much is commutative justice, fair exchange within the global south, but between the south and the north in the international trade context. So there are many, many themes. I don't want to confuse, but I do want to articulate that bulk of what is happening, which we deem as growth, is happening outside the purview of law and institutions. And that's where bulk of the human rights violations are. So, you know, people don't have contracts, people don't live outside the safety net, there's no unemployment insurance, and yet growth is happening in that particular sector. And there is a big debate, should we formalize, should we not formalize, how to formalize, etc. So I just wanted to share some of these reflections with you.
Thank you. I'll take the 2 remaining questions.
It seems to me like if we just rely on NGOs and international organizations, given the restrictions on funding, given the fact that everyone's scrambling for funding in that area, it seems like we're not going to get very far in terms of improving human rights, and we have no choice but to draft in the private sector to help us in this fight. And I was wondering, so Professor, you were criticizing the shift towards a very market-centered conception and formulation of human rights in terms of gender equality and labor rights. I was wondering, if you don't term these rights in terms that the private sector can understand and relate to, like efficiency and growth, how else do you want them to get involved? How else can we expect them to join this effort?
Thank you. So I'll give a chance to our panelists to answer.
I think that was for you. That wasn't for me.
Or you can now express your views
Actually,
and
you talked a little about the efficiency, the framing of gender in efficiency terms.
Right.
I think that's
Okay.
for you.
I think we should, maybe the place to start is just simply to observe the shift. And I think whether it's good or whether it's bad is an open question. And maybe the way to think about it is both. I mean, my own sense is that some engagement on the part of the private sector is inevitable, it's underway, and it's catalyzed by all kinds of transformations. But I think anybody who imagines that the role, how to put this, You want to think about what the private sector can do, what it can't do, what it's likely to do given its other concerns, and what it's likely to leave aside. And I think there's no question that you can get somewhere on some things by engaging the private sector, and probably quite a lot farther than you can by simply relying on standard old-fashioned regulatory apparatuses. But there are also really, really big questions that are very unlikely to be addressed simply by relying on a convergence of interests between the interests of firms and those of communities and those of workers. Sadly, there's some of the biggest questions of our time. The questions of, economic despoliation and the limits of growth. They're the problems of economic inequality, the distribution of gains, which are massively concentrated. So Apple has been on the table as an example here. Apple is staggeringly profitable and successful. I mean, I think their last quarterly profits were sales or profits, something like $73 billion, something amazing, right? So tons of money floating around there. But at the same time, their workers in China are, throwing themselves out of the window and committing suicide because working conditions are really poor, right? We can and probably must engage Apple, but we've got a much bigger series of issues that we need to engage.
Thank you. So I would like to thank our panelists for being here today, and thanks for your very interesting presentations.